Evolution and Creation Science, an in-depth analysis of two perspectives on origins. Hello everyone. Today we will explore one of humanity's most fundamental questions. Where did we come from? This question has captivated philosophers, theologians, and scientists for thousands of years. In modern society, answers to this question are divided into two main perspectives: evolutionary theory and creation science. These two paradigms extend beyond mere scientific theories or religious beliefs. They have become lenses through which we understand the world. Today, we will examine these two perspectives in depth, comparing their strengths and weaknesses, philosophical foundations, and ways of interpreting evidence. First, I should clarify that the explanation and critique of evolutionary theory presented in this audiobook represent an academic analysis and do not necessarily reflect the speaker's personal beliefs or claims. Our goal is to provide a balanced perspective that helps listeners draw their own informed conclusions. Chapter 1: Basic Understanding of Evolutionary Theory. Evolutionary theory formally began with Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in the 19th century. Darwin developed the concept of natural selection through his observations in the Galapagos Islands. The core of this theory is simple. Organisms undergo random variations. Those best adapted to their environment survive and pass their characteristics to offspring. Over time, these small changes accumulate, leading to the emergence of new species. Modern evolutionary theory, or the modern synthesis, integrates Darwin's natural selection with Mendelian genetics and 20th century discoveries in molecular biology. This theory explains that species change through four main mechanisms: mutations, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. Evidence for evolution includes fossil records, comparative anatomy, developmental biology, and DNA analysis. These pieces of evidence are interpreted as supporting the common descent theory that all living beings descended from a common ancestor. However, let's take a step back and think about this. While evolutionary theory is based on scientific methodology, its interpretation still rests on particular philosophical premises. That is the naturalistic worldview. Naturalism assumes that all phenomena can be explained by natural causes and laws. This approach excludes supernatural beings or interventions. Such premises may be useful in scientific methodology, but whether they represent the only path to knowledge is a philosophical debate. Some call this methodological naturalism, acknowledging that science is limited to studying natural phenomena. Others proceed to metaphysical naturalism, claiming nothing exists beyond nature. Chapter 2: Strengths and Limitations of Evolutionary Theory. Evolutionary theory's greatest strength lies in its predictive and explanatory power. For example, Darwin predicted the existence of a moth with a long proboscis to pollinate certain flowers, and this moth was later discovered. Phenomena such as antibiotic-resistant bacteria or the rapid mutation of HIV can also be explained by evolutionary principles. Moreover, evolutionary theory serves as a unifying theory in biology, connecting various research fields. Discoveries in ecology, genetics, paleontology, and molecular biology find consistent explanations within the framework of evolution. However, evolutionary theory also has aspects that should be critically examined. First, the incompleteness of the fossil record. The so-called missing links, transitional fossils, are often not found. This may be due to the rarity of the fossilization process itself, but it is pointed out as a gap between theory and evidence. Second, the difficulty of explaining the gradual development of complex organs. For example, explaining how complex organs like the eye develop through gradual changes is not easy. Evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins have attempted to explain this, but many questions remain. Third, the problem of the early origin of life. Evolutionary theory explains the changes in already existing organisms, but does not provide a complete explanation of how the first organism arose from inorganic matter. Research like the Miller-Urey experiment exists, but we are still far from a complete understanding of the origin of life. Finally, evolutionary theory attempts to answer how questions, but remains silent on why questions. Questions about the purpose or meaning of life transcend the realm of science. This can be seen not as a flaw in evolutionary theory, but as an inherent limitation of scientific methodology. Adding a somewhat cynical perspective, the scientific community supporting evolutionary theory sometimes tends to adhere to existing paradigms rather than modifying theories when faced with new evidence. As Thomas Kuhn pointed out in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the scientific community also has a human aspect that resists paradigm shifts. Listeners, this is a phenomenon that appears in any field, so don't be surprised. Chapter 3: Basic Understanding of Creation Science. Now let's look at the alternative perspective, creation science. Creation science attempts to interpret the origins of the universe and life based on the biblical account of creation. Particularly representative is young earth creationism, which interprets the six-day creation account in Genesis 1 literally. The core claims of creation science are as follows. The universe and life were designed with purpose by God the Creator. Earth and organisms were created in a relatively short time, about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Biblical events like the Great Flood explain geological records. Biological species are basically fixed, and large-scale evolution does not occur. Creation scientists view the existence of complex organisms as evidence of a designer. The so-called intelligent design theory argues that the complexity and sophistication of organisms cannot be explained by chance processes and requires the existence of an intelligent designer. For example, Michael Behe's concept of irreducible complexity points out that structures like bacterial flagella can only function when all parts work simultaneously. However, creation science also has its own philosophical premises. That is the belief that the Bible contains historical and scientific truths. This premise, derived from religious faith, acknowledges a different path to knowledge than scientific methodology. Chapter 4: Strengths and Limitations of Creation Science. What are the strengths of creation science? First, creation science provides an integrated explanation of the purpose and meaning of life and the universe. While evolutionary theory focuses on how, creation science attempts to answer why questions as well. Second, creation science presents alternative interpretations for some scientific problems. For example, regarding the Cambrian explosion, where diverse species suddenly appeared in a relatively short period of time, creation science interprets this as evidence of a creation event rather than gradual evolution. Third, creation science brings to the fore metaphysical and philosophical questions often overlooked in scientific inquiry. This can promote important reflection on the philosophical foundations of how science operates. However, creation science also faces several criticisms. First, a clash with traditional scientific methodology. While science seeks natural explanations and methodologically excludes supernatural interventions, creation science presupposes the existence of a supernatural creator. This creates a fundamental difference from mainstream scientific methodology. Second, the issue of dating the Earth. Various scientific methods such as radiometric dating, stratigraphic analysis, and ice core analysis estimate the Earth's age at about 4.5 billion years. This is vastly different from the young Earth claimed by creation science. Third, the problem of interpreting biological evidence. DNA analysis comparative anatomy, and developmental evidence strongly suggest genetic relationships between species. Creation science interprets this as the result of a common designer, but whether this interpretation adequately explains all the data is debated. And adding a somewhat satirical perspective here, it can seem ironic that creation science sometimes borrows scientific terminology and methodology, while conclusions are already determined from the Bible. It sometimes appears like setting the conclusion first and then seeking evidence. Of course, evolutionary theory might not be completely free from this either, as it interprets evidence through the lens of a naturalistic worldview. Chapter 5. Comparison of philosophical foundations. Now let's compare the philosophical foundations of evolutionary theory and creation science more deeply. This is not just a scientific debate, but also a clash of worldviews. The philosophical foundation of evolutionary theory is naturalism. Naturalism views only the natural world as real, and believes all phenomena can be explained by natural causes. This tends to exclude supernatural interventions and recognize only empirically verifiable knowledge. In contrast, the philosophical foundation of creation science is theistic realism. This acknowledges a transcendent reality beyond the material world, namely God, and views revealed knowledge through the Bible as an important source of knowledge. From this perspective, not all truths can be grasped by scientific methods alone. The difference between these two worldviews affects the interpretation of evidence. For example, looking at the same fossil record, an evolutionist might interpret it as evidence of gradual evolution, while a creation scientist might see it as the result of catastrophes like the Great Flood. Interestingly, both perspectives have limitations. Naturalism may remain silent on questions beyond empirical verification, such as the nature of consciousness, the foundation of morality, the meaning of existence, or offer only reductionist answers. Meanwhile, theistic realism includes the possibility that interpretations of religious texts can vary and potentially conflict with scientific evidence. But what's more interesting is that these two perspectives are not entirely incompatible. There are intermediate positions, such as theistic evolution or progressive creationism. These seek harmony by viewing God's creative acts as occurring through evolutionary processes, or by interpreting the days of creation not as literal 24-hour periods, but as long epochs. Here we feel the need for philosophical humility. Human knowledge is always partial and provisional. This is true for both scientists and theologians. 1 Corinthians 13:12 beautifully expresses this. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. Chapter 6. The two perspectives in education and public discourse. The conflict between evolutionary theory and creation science is also an important issue in education and public policy. Particularly, debates about whether creationism should be taught in school science classes continue in many countries. In the United States, the Federal Supreme Court ruled in Edwards versus Aguilar in 1987 that teaching creationism as science in public schools violates the constitutional prohibition on establishing religion. Later attempts to include intelligent design in science curricula also resulted in the 2005 Dover case ruling that intelligent design is essentially a religious view. These legal decisions reflect the scientific community's position that methodological naturalism must be maintained in science education. However, from another perspective, this could be seen as only one worldview, namely naturalistic philosophy, being reinforced through public education. So how should we approach this issue? One alternative is to teach the methodology and theories of modern science in science classes, but also teach the philosophical premises and limitations of science. Also, in religion, philosophy and history classes, opportunities can be provided to learn about various worldviews and how they interpret science. Mutual respect and open dialogue are needed in public discourse as well. Evolutionists should not ignore or ridicule the fundamental questions and concerns of creationists, and creationists should participate in dialogue while recognizing the value of scientific evidence and methodology. Such dialogue may not be easy, but as Micah 6:8 says, we are required to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. We need an attitude that pursues scientific truth while respecting each other's human value and dignity. Chapter 7. Case Study: Human Origins. To understand the differences between evolutionary theory and creation science more concretely, let's examine a specific topic: human origins. From an evolutionary perspective, humans, or Homo sapiens, are estimated to have emerged in Africa about 300,000 years ago. This is supported by fossil records and DNA analysis. The human evolutionary tree includes various ancestral species like Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus. Modern human genetics research supports the hypotheses of mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam, suggesting all modern humans have common ancestors originating in Africa. From a creationist perspective, humans were created by God's direct creative act. Genesis 1:27 states, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Creation scientists claim that the missing link between humans and apes has not been found, and interpret fossil humans like Neanderthals as variations within human groups after the flood. A notable point here is that DNA analysis suggests all modern humans descended from relatively recent common ancestors. This is expressed in the concepts of mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam. Interestingly, these scientific discoveries can draw some parallels with the biblical story of Adam and Eve. Of course, there are still big differences in timeline and interpretation. The question of human origins extends beyond simple biological questions to fundamental questions about human identity and value. From an evolutionary perspective, humans are random products of natural selection. But from a creationist perspective, humans are special beings bearing God's image. Psalm 8:4-5 speaks of this. "What is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor." This passage beautifully expresses the special position and value of humans. Chapter 8. The Problem of Evidence Interpretation. Interpretation of scientific evidence is central to the evolution versus creation science debate. The same evidence can lead to different conclusions when viewed through different interpretive frameworks. For example, fossil records are interpreted by evolutionists as evidence of gradual change in species, but by creation scientists as results of catastrophes like Noah's flood. DNA similarities are evidence of common ancestry to evolutionists, but can be viewed as evidence of a common designer by creation scientists. These differences in interpretation connect to what philosophy of science calls theory-dependent observation. All observation and evidence interpretation takes place within a specific theoretical framework, and completely neutral observation is impossible. Thomas Kuhn's paradigm theory presents a similar perspective. Here, we again feel the limitations of human knowledge and the need for humility. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." This is a word of wisdom advising us to use our intellectual abilities while acknowledging their limitations and ultimately trusting in God. Chapter 9. Possibility of integrating science and faith. The opposition between evolutionary theory and creation science often gives the impression that science and religion inevitably conflict. However, historically, many scientists held deep religious beliefs. Kepler, Newton, Pascal, Maxwell all harmonized their scientific inquiries with faith. In modern times, scholars like Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project, John Polkinghorne, quantum physicist and Anglican priest, and Alistair McGrath, molecular biologist and theologian, continue to harmonize science and faith. They present integrative perspectives such as theistic evolution. These middle positions offer perspectives like God created the universe and established natural laws, fulfilling his purposes through these laws, including evolution. Science answers questions about how. Theology answers questions about why. The Bible is not a science textbook, but is meant to convey theological and spiritual truths. Of course, these integrative perspectives receive criticism from both sides. Some scientists see this as introducing unnecessary religious elements into science, and some theologians see it as a compromise weakening biblical authority. However, Hebrews 11:3 says, "By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." This suggests that when looking at the world through eyes of faith, one can recognize the Creator beyond visible physical processes. Chapter 10. Meaning and Impact in Everyday Life. How does the evolution versus creation science debate affect our daily lives? This is not just an academic debate, but directly impacts our worldview and values. First, it affects our understanding of human value and dignity. From an evolutionary perspective, humans are products of natural selection. But from a creationist perspective, humans are special beings bearing God's image. These differences in understanding can influence approaches to bioethics, human rights, and environmental issues. Second, it affects our understanding of the foundation of morality and ethics. From an evolutionary perspective, morality can be seen as a product of social adaptation, but from a creationist perspective, morality is understood as reflecting the character of the Creator. This leads to different answers to the question, where does right and wrong come from? Third, it affects our understanding of life's purpose and meaning. From an evolutionary perspective, life's purpose is something individuals or society create for themselves, but from a creationist perspective, life's purpose is found in relationship with the Creator. Adding a somewhat cynical perspective, in modern society, many people tend to uncritically accept everything presented in the name of science. The phrase, "science has proven," is often used like a modern incantation. But we need to remember that scientific knowledge is continually revised and evolves. Today's scientific fact might become tomorrow's scientific error. Nevertheless, while acknowledging the value of scientific inquiry, we should be careful not to fall into scientism, thinking science can answer all questions. Similarly, we need a balanced perspective that recognizes the value of faith without ignoring or dismissing scientific discoveries. Isaiah 55:8-9 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We need a humble recognition that our human thinking and knowledge have limitations, and God's thoughts and methods transcend our understanding. Chapter 11. Case Study: Origin of Human Consciousness. The origin of human consciousness is a fascinating topic in the evolution versus creation science debate. Here, consciousness refers to mental phenomena, including self-awareness, subjective experience, and free will. From an evolutionary perspective, consciousness is seen as gradually emerging with the development of complex nervous systems. The development of the cerebral cortex, especially the expansion of areas responsible for higher cognitive functions like the prefrontal lobe, is seen as the biological basis of consciousness. From this perspective, consciousness developed as an adaptive trait, favorable for survival and reproduction. However, a difficulty here is the hard problem raised by philosopher David Chalmers. This problem is the difficulty in explaining why and how physical brain processes generate subjective experience. There exists an explanatory gap between neural activity and subjective experience. From a creationist perspective, human consciousness is seen as the result of God's special creative act. Genesis 2:7 says, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." Here, living being or nefesh chaya means more than just biological life. It refers to a conscious and spiritual being. From this perspective, human consciousness, especially moral awareness and spiritual sensitivity, is understood as a core element of the image of God, imago Dei. Our ability to appreciate beauty, make moral judgments, and recognize transcendent reality is not simply evolutionary chance, but the result of the Creator's intentional design. Particularly interesting is the fact that human religious tendency is universal. Belief in supernatural beings and acts of worship are found in all cultures. Evolutionists try to explain this as a mechanism for group cohesion or dealing with uncertainty, but from a creationist perspective, it is seen as an expression of longing for God. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart." The problem of consciousness origin is a difficult challenge that cannot be fully resolved by scientific methods alone. Here we see that science and faith can answer different dimensions of questions and play complementary roles. Chapter 12. Synthesis and Conclusion. The Path of Wisdom. So far, we have examined the basic concepts, strengths, limitations, and philosophical foundations of evolutionary theory and creation science, two worldviews. Now I would like to synthesize these and offer some concluding insights. First, science and faith fundamentally try to answer different questions. Science answers questions of how, faith answers questions of why. Science deals with mechanisms, faith deals with meaning and purpose. When understood as complementary, rather than opposed, we can have a richer worldview. Second, all knowledge systems have their limitations. Scientific knowledge is limited to empirically verifiable domains, and theological knowledge faces challenges of interpretive diversity and subjectivity. Intellectual humility that recognizes these limitations is necessary. Third, interpretation of evidence always takes place in the context of a specific worldview. Neutral interpretation is virtually impossible, and we all make some form of leap of faith, whether to a naturalistic or theistic worldview. Fourth, we must maintain critical thinking while respecting diverse perspectives. Ignoring or ridiculing people with different views does not help constructive dialogue and truth-seeking. So how should we approach this complex issue? The Bible offers us a wise path. Proverbs 9:10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." This suggests that the starting point of all knowledge and wisdom is acknowledging and respecting God. Also, Colossians 2:2-3 says, "My goal is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love, so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge." Ultimate wisdom and knowledge are in Christ. In the end, when we explore the origins of the universe and life, we need a perspective that sees the Creator's wisdom and power, through the laws and patterns of nature, discovered through scientific methods. Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." At the same time, we must maintain humility that recognizes the limits of human knowledge and trusts in God, the source of all truth. As Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." I hope this exploratory journey on evolutionary theory and creation science has provided you with new thoughts and insights. The topics we have covered are complex and deep issues, so I encourage you to continue researching, questioning, and seeking truth. Remember, all journeys of true knowledge ultimately lead us to God, the source of that knowledge. Thank you sincerely for listening to this audiobook for so long. If you want more in-depth topics and biblical insights, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on notifications to be the first to know when new content is uploaded. Your interest and support drive us to create richer and deeper content. We look forward to seeing you again on our next topic. Thank you.